Welcome, dark friends, to the 12th episode of Wraiths of the Appalachian, Sheepsquatch. I imagine that most of you are familiar with the name Sasquatch as one of the many names attributed to Bigfoot, perhaps the most famous of all North American cryptids. But Sheepsquatch? I'm guessing not so much. Will Eddie and Snarly Yow come face to face, or should I say toe to toe, with this frightening creature? And would such an encounter be the most frightening thing they experience in this episode? Only one way to find out. Let's begin our story. Chapter 12, Sheepsquatch. Okay, I've got a question, and for once, I'd love a straight answer. Eddie gripped the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the highway before him. Do you know what's going to happen when you send me to these places? The radio crackled as Mr. D's voice broke through.
It's as I've said before, Eddie. Nothing about the future is certain.
But do you know what might happen?
Yes.
Did you suspect that these goblin things would be here? Again?
I knew there was a strong possibility, yes.
Are these the same creatures I saw in the woods near Hopkinsville?
I don't know.
Eddie's eyebrows shot up. That's the first time you've admitted to not knowing something.
There are worlds of possibilities. So many that no one can know them all, Eddie.
Yeah, but usually you just shut up. The radio crackled, but Mr. D did not speak. Like that. When the radio remained quiet for another minute, Eddie broke the silence with another question. So what are those things?
What do they seem like to you?
Oh, we're gonna play that game, huh?
What game is that, Eddie?
The one where you answer questions with more questions.
It seems like a game to you?
One you're really good at. Eddie was forced to speak again when Mr. D did not respond. Okay, I'll go. They seem like larger versions of the freakish baby the moon-eyed woman was holding in my dream back in Georgia. If that even was a dream.
Perhaps you're on to something.
Like what exactly? The baby, or whether that was a dream or not?
Perhaps both.
I don't even know what the moon-eyed people are. What I saw made it seem like they're a race of space people who had sex with some kind of demons. That might explain what these goblins are.
It might indeed.
Well, does it?
It's certainly one possibility.
Come on, D, Eddie said as he beat the steering wheel enough for Snarly Yow to raise his head from the floorboard. Does it or doesn't it?
There are endless possibilities, Eddie. Each of them is just as real as another.
Eddie found Mr. D's calmness even more irritating. That makes absolutely no sense. They're either real or they're a crazy figment of my imagination.
Are you trying to convince me or yourself?
It was Eddie's turn to be silent. Once he had calmed himself, he continued. So you're saying there are lots of possibilities, all of which can be true. Like different dimensions, different realities, all playing out at the same time.
Now you're getting it.
Eddie blew out a breath and spoke with a tone of barely controlled frustration. But since I'm in this one, I'd kind of like to know what's going on here.
Quite understandable.
But I don't understand a damn thing. Why do these things keep popping up wherever I go?
I can't answer that for you, Eddie.
And yet you keep directing me to them.
I'm directing you to places, not to anyone or anything specifically.
Eddie frowned as he considered Mr. D's statement. Places where you know something will happen.
I'm directing you to places, not to anyone or anything specifically.
But you don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
Just that something is going to happen.
That's correct.
They drove on for several minutes before Eddie spoke again. These goblin things pretended to be the Flatwoods monster. Is that what Catherine May and her boys saw back in 1952? Did they just see some mischievous goblins?
I don't know what those people saw.
So they might have seen a real monster from outer space? Or something from another dimension?
Anything is possible.
But what I saw was probably an illusion created by those creatures.
That seems like a very likely possibility.
Just an illusion. And I was never in any real danger.
I didn't say that.
Another moment passed with only the sounds of the engine and the tires on the highway. Eddie asked, "What about that shadow thing I saw near the campground? Was that the goblins? Something killed the engine like that back in Hopkinsville, too."
Did it seem like the goblins made that happen at the time?
Eddie thought for a moment. No, it seemed like something else. Something much worse, or bigger.
You should trust your instincts.
So what was it? And why did it leave me alone?
I can't answer that for you, Eddie. Perhaps it just wasn't the right time.
Eddie felt the skin prickle on the back of his neck. The right time for what?
Just the right time.
Is it possible that something else, something like, I don't know, a higher power, killed the engine?
It's quite possible.
Would this higher power be a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes.
Eddie snorted at the non-answer. Okay, got it. Both are possible. So let me see if I've got this straight. Eddie gestured in the air, holding up one finger as if Mr. D could see him. 1, you aren't directing me to specific events, only to specific places where certain things might happen.
Correct.
2, these things that I experience that seem like dreams might be just as real as my everyday normal waking life. They're just happening in another dimension, maybe like a parallel dimension.
Correct, roughly speaking.
Close enough, Eddie said. He held up 3 fingers. 3. For some reason, I can sometimes see these events take place, or these beings for that matter, when other people can't. Like seeing Jake Warren in the Big Fella's Diner.
When most other people can't, some people can.
Like Arcana being able to see Snarly Yow.
Yes.
But I thought maybe seeing Jake and Snarly Yow was like being able to see a ghost. Some people are sensitive and some people aren't.
Yes, that's right.
So Snarly Yow is a ghost?
Not exactly.
He's something from another dimension.
Yes.
Like Jake.
Not really. They're a little different.
My head hurts.
You need to focus on the road anyway. The exit you should take is coming up.
At the end of the exit ramp, Mr. D told Eddie to take a left where he would find several fast food options. Eddie pulled into the drive-thru at the KFC since he thought Snarly might enjoy the chicken bones. Once they had their food and drinks, Mr. D directed Eddie through a neighborhood of modest 2-story homes and an assortment of small businesses until they came to a parking lot by a curving river with a sign designating it as Palatine Park. Across the river, Eddie saw the taller buildings that comprised the main business district of Fairmont, West Virginia. It appeared that Eddie might have happened upon another festival, for the parking lot was nearly full. A crowd bigger than Eddie imagined was typical, even for a sunny Sunday afternoon, walked the paved pathways of the park. Beyond a performance stage, a greenway stretched out along the river. Eddie grabbed the food and Snarly Yow bounded across the driver's seat and exited the van. Let's find us a nice quiet spot for our meal by the river, okay, boy? The wolf dog looked at Eddie and wagged his tail. As Eddie prepared to lock the van, he frowned for a second and then walked around to the side door and pulled his guitar out. Once the bus was secured, he and Snarly Yow followed the sidewalk closest to the river. Soon they found an isolated park bench overlooking the water where a small dock extended into the river. Snarly made short work of the pieces of chicken that Eddie gave him, and within minutes, Eddie was licking his fingers and looking for a trash can. Although the park was full of people, only a few trickled past the site where Eddie sat and played his favorite songs. Eddie had no qualms about people hearing him play. He'd performed in public for years, but there by the river in the shade of the trees with the sunlight sparkling on the river, he allowed himself to enjoy the act of playing simply for the music. Snarly Yow lay in the grass watching Eddie's fingers pick the strings and travel up and down the neck of the guitar. Medicine for the soul, Eddie thought. As he finished up an instrumental piece he had written in his early 20s and nearly forgotten, he heard clapping behind him. He turned to see a black couple smiling at him from the sidewalk where they had apparently been listening for some time. Their dress was flashier than the t-shirts and shorts most of the other people in the park were wearing. The woman wore a short, tightly fitting black skirt with a silk top featuring a multicolored floral print. It looked more like a serape than a blouse, and its plunging neckline showed much of her smooth brown skin. The thick black curls that extended to her shoulders did not hide the large silver hoop earrings, and the sandals that laced up nearly to her knees accentuated her shapely legs. The man who accompanied her reminded Eddie of a young version of his father. He wore tight black jeans with a scarlet silk shirt unbuttoned nearly to his midriff, revealing his fit form. His flat-brimmed black hat might have evoked the image of Stevie Ray Vaughan to most people Eddie's age. To Eddie, the purple ribbon hat band, decorated with large pieces of costume jewelry, seemed a specific nod to Jimi Hendrix. "Very nice, my man. Very nice indeed." The young man touched the brim of his hat in greeting to Eddie along with the compliment. "You better watch him, T," the woman said with a playful push at her partner, "or he'll be replacing you for the gig." She turned back to Eddie and said, "I don't think I've seen you around Fairmont before. You look a little old to be one of the university kids, if you don't mind my saying, but you're good enough to be playing at the clubs. Did you play somewhere around here last night?" "Thanks," Eddie answered. "No, I'm just passing through. I saw the park and thought it looked like a good place to unwind a bit." "It is at that. And it's easy to get wound up, ain't it?" She smiled at Eddie and stepped closer as she pulled the young man with her. "I'm Flora," she said, releasing her hold on her partner and extending a hand out to Eddie. "And this is T." The two men fist-bumped as Eddie introduced himself. "T? Yeah. My father loved improv jazz and practically worshipped Thelonious Monk, so I'm named for him. I play keyboards a bit, but it's really not my thing, if you know what I'm saying." "Did I hear you say you had a gig tonight?" Eddie asked. "Yeah," T answered. "Well, today, actually. We're playing here in the park in about an hour. Part of the summer music series. Maybe you can catch us." "Definitely," Eddie said. "My day just got a lot better." "Was you having a bad day, sugar?" Flora asked. "Not bad, necessarily. Just weird, I guess you'd say. I've been having a lot of weird days lately." "I hear that," T said. "Listen, after the show, come on and meet the rest of the band. We're going to head out to Gray and Dawn's farm and kick back a bit. Jam a little, see what mischief we can stir up. Gray's who put the band together in the first place, and he and his wife are good people. You'll like them." Eddie looked over at Snarly Yow, who had been watching the exchange patiently but with interest. "Sure, sounds good. I don't know about afterwards. I got to figure out where to stay for the night, but I'd love to meet the band." The buzz of a loudspeaker caught their attention as a male voice boomed throughout the park. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the final event in our Summer Music in the Park series. Please put your hands together for our first band today, Teal Steel, the Frankfort, Pennsylvania Middle School Steel Drum Band." "So you've got a steel drum band kicking you off?" Eddie said with a big grin. "Yeah, we're headliners now, baby," T laughed. "Gotta book us days in advance if you want us." "Oh, hush," Flora said, slapping T's arm. "This is a decent paying gig." I know, T said. "I was just teasing." "Beats playing at a funeral home," Eddie said. Flora and T looked at Eddie with wide eyes. "It's a long story." The tinny metallic strains of Here Comes the Sun rang out over the park as the trio paused their banter to listen. "See now? Those kids ain't bad," Flora said. "But that's our cue to go. They said the steel band was only going to play for about 20 minutes and we go on after them. We better start getting our stuff out of the van." "Oh, let the roadies get it," T said. Flora shot him a frown with her hand on her hips. "Oh, right. We are the roadies." "Listen, we'll see you after the show, right, Eddie?" "Right." Eddie gave them a single wave as they made their way back up towards the stage area. Eddie closed up his guitar case, and he and Snarly made their way back to the van. Once it was secured, they began a slow walk to explore the rest of the park as the sounds from the steel drums continued to fill the air. At the opposite end of the greenway from the stage, children played in a splash zone where large metal flowers shot sprays of water up into the air to land back on their gigantic petals, to the delight of the children running and squealing below. People lined up at food trucks to buy tacos, euros, and drinks, while some older kids threw a frisbee in the softball field that lay beyond the splash zone. Eddie paused just beyond the play area to gaze at a large bridge which spanned the river into the denser part of the town, which boasted a significant skyline for such a small city. "Not a bad stop, is it, boy?" Eddie said to the wolf dog, who walked beside him, unobserved by everyone in the crowd as far as he could tell. "We'll have to be sure to thank Mr. D. But then, most of our stops start out fine like this," Eddie thought. The announcer's voice rang out again, and Eddie turned to look back at the stage. "Before we introduce our next act, I'd like to thank some of the folks who have made this music series and other events in the park possible." As the middle schoolers carried their steel drums off stage, Eddie saw T carrying his electric guitar out and plugging it into an amplifier that was already in place. Flora positioned one mic stand on stage left for another singer, and then went to stand a few feet behind the announcer, where she waited with her hands clasped below her waist. A long-haired, skinny, bearded white man in a black T-shirt with a white image of a screaming, horned monster took his place at the drum set near the back of the stage. A clean-shaven younger man with long, straight black hair carrying a black Gibson Thunderbird bass positioned himself to Flora's left. The embroidered shirt he wore suggested indigenous heritage. He plucked several strings and adjusted the knobs on the body of the bass, which competed to be heard with the notes from another guitar player, a man wearing jeans and a black leather vest over a green T-shirt, who also tested the microphone Flora had set up. The amount of gray mixed in his long brown hair and goatee suggested that he might be the oldest member of the band, and perhaps the owner of the farm T and Flora had mentioned. "Our next act is a band we're proud to call our own. They're from right here in Fairmont, and we are thrilled to have them back in our summer music series lineup as we close out another fine season. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Fairmont is proud to present West Virginia's best rock blues band, Sheepsquatch." After only a few bars of the first song, Eddie found himself wondering why this band was only playing small gigs in West Virginia. Man, they're really good. They started with a few crowd-pleasing covers from southern rock bands like the Allman Brothers, Government Mule, and the Tedeschi Trucks Band, and Eddie saw that T might very well give Warren Haynes or Derek Trucks a run for their money as lead guitarist. Dwayne Allman himself would have been impressed, Eddie thought. After the fourth song, the band began their original material, and Eddie found it just as pleasing as the cover songs. Flora had sounded good before, but her soulful voice as she sang original tunes evoked the power of Janis Joplin at her best. The thought that she and T had complimented his own playing earlier sent a warm tingle of pride through him. But then that sensation suddenly drained. T set his electric guitar in a stand and picked up an acoustic with a pickup for amplification. The other older guitarist put away his guitar as well and picked up a flute. The tempo and melody of the new tune were lively and light and reminded Eddie of something Jethro Tull might have performed back in the day. The crowd grinned and clapped along with the drummer, who encouraged them by standing behind his drum set while beating and shaking a tambourine. The song was much faster and more upbeat than what Eddie recalled, but the archaic lyrics were lines Eddie would never forget.
My pretty main thing, what I know, what thing it is, will breed delight that strives to stand, that cannot go, that feeds the mouth, that cannot bite.
The memory of the terrifying night in the cave in Tennessee came flooding back. Flora strutted and danced seductively as she sang, shooting the suggestive lines of the first verses at T like darts.
With a humble down, hey, humble down, hey.
With each successive verse, Flora sought out various males in the audience to sing to, and when she reached the punchline of each stanza, the crowd laughed and clapped. Eddie watched from the edge of the crowd, but close enough to the stage for Flora to make eye contact with him for the last verse.
It has a head much like a mole's, and yet it loves to creep and hold.
Eddie shut his eyes and then turned away to walk toward the sidewalk by the river. With a quick shrug and a raise of her eyebrows, but without missing a beat, Flora returned her attention to T to deliver the final lines of the song.
The fairest maid that e'er took life for love of Dix.
Rather than groping him crudely as the spirit had done to Eddie in the cave, she gripped T's shoulders, which stopped all the music, kissed him, and then sang the last phrase a cappella.
Became a wife.
Snarly Yow followed as Eddie sought out the bench where he had played earlier. The wolf dog sat and looked up at his human companion. Eddie focused on slow, controlled breathing he hoped would fend off a panic attack. As the crowd laughed and applauded after the final line, Eddie closed his eyes and let out a big breath. Eddie listened to the rest of the band's performance from his spot by the river. The remaining songs were much more in line with the other tunes in the set, and Eddie enjoyed the rest of the concert from his spot by the river. When he heard Flora thanking the crowd, he rose and made his way back to the stage area, moving against the stream of the exiting crowd. "Hey, you!" Flora called out to him when she saw him. "I thought you'd left." "No, I just needed to sit down for a bit," Eddie said as he glanced away toward the river. Flora narrowed her eyes, but smiled when he turned back to look at her. "That was a great performance. You guys are really good." "Oh, thanks." Flora smiled and then called across the stage to the older guitarist. "Hey, Gray, come over here for a sec. This is the guy I was telling you about." He snapped the guitar case closed where he had crouched to stow his guitar, rose, and walked over to Flora and Eddie. "Hey, I'm Eddie Bowen. Gray Jordan." He shook the hand Eddie extended as T walked up to join them. "Flora said she and T heard you playing a while ago. She also said you were pretty good, which is high praise." "I've gotten rusty, I'm ashamed to say," Eddie replied. "I'm just recently getting back in the groove." T turned toward Gray and said, "I told Eddie he should drop by your place since we were all getting together there." Gray smiled and nodded. "Definitely. We always like meeting other musicians." "Sounds good," Eddie answered. "I need to find a place to camp for the night first, and then I'll head on over. You know of a cheap campground around here?" "Save your money. We got plenty of land for you to camp on," Gray said. "Don't have much else. Land rich and dirt poor, as they say. So why don't you come on out? Dawn's going to bake some of her famous magic pizzas, so you don't even have to worry about supper. Just bring whatever you want to drink. Give me your phone and I'll enter my contact info with our address." When he'd finished, he handed the phone back to Eddie and called out to the rest of the band, "You guys ready to head out? You're coming on out to the farm, aren't you?" The other band members nodded and gave thumbs up as they headed to the parking lot with their instruments and gear. "See you in a bit, then." Gray flashed his white teeth in a winning smile that made Eddie see why he was the leader of the group. His father had possessed the same kind of charisma, a genuine warmth that made women and men love him, something which at times had been a source of stress for his mother. "Should be nice to socialize with folks again," Eddie said to Snarly Yow. The dog looked from Eddie to the departing band and then back to Eddie. "Let's go get a six-pack for the evening," Eddie said, and they headed for the van. "Okay, I've got to ask," Eddie said, wiping his fingers on his jeans after finishing his second piece of pizza. He paused and took a swig from his beer. He sat with his new friends from the band who sprawled on blankets around a blazing fire pit. "That acoustic song you did about halfway through the set?" T nodded. "The Maiden's Riddle? Flora just wrote that." "She just wrote it?" Flora set her drink down and smiled. "I've never written a song so fast. The tune came to me 3 or 4 days ago while I was cutting some flowers from my garden to make an arrangement. I love having fresh flowers in the house. And I started humming it. Then the words came. That happens to me sometimes, but I'd never received those kind of old-timey words before. By the time the arrangement was made, I had the whole song. T heard me singing it and thought it was pretty good." "Yeah, I did," T said. "It's definitely not like anything else we do, but I told her she should share it with the band that night, when we were rehearsing for this gig." "I'm glad you did," Gray added. "I think it was the perfect song to add to our set. It was easy to add the instrumental pieces to it. It just all fell together like it was meant to be. And clearly the audience thought so too, based on their reaction." "For everyone but Eddie. You didn't seem to like it too much, did you, darling?" Flora looked at Eddie with an exaggerated pout. Eddie's scalp prickled. "The ghost in the cave sang that song to me exactly 4 days ago," he thought. He shook his head and forced a smile. "No, it sounded great. It just brought back some memories." Flora squinted at him and tilted her head. Before she could say anything else, Eddie said, But I got another question. Really important. All heads turned toward him, their interest piqued. Sheepsquatch? Really? Where'd that name come from? Everyone laughed, and Manson, the drummer, spoke first, brushing his black hair away from his eyes and stroking his dark goatee before he spoke. It's our very own monster, bigger and badder than that pitiful pansy-ass Bigfoot, and much better looking. Sheepsquatch is a huge creature with white shaggy fur, sharp teeth, and long curving horns. He gestured wildly as he spoke, and the firelight reflected in his intense, black, shining eyes brought to Eddie's mind the inspiration for the drummer's infamous nickname. The young woman with long purple hair beside him, whom Eddie assumed was his girlfriend, even though she might have been half his age, snorted and then buried her head against his shoulder. Some people say it's more like a big white dog, Gray said. Oh, come on, Manson argued. It's got to be more than just a dog. Big farm animals, cattle, and horses were torn to pieces, they say. Well, not just any dog, Gray said. He took a big sip of his beer and continued. A phantom dog. More like a huge dire wolf. Eddie looked down at Snarly Yow, who sat calmly beside him. None of the group who had gathered at the Jordan farm seemed to be able to see the wolfhound, and Eddie was just fine with that. Gray continued his explanation for the local cryptid that gave the band their name. That ridge over there, he said as he pointed off into the darkness to the east, although it was too dark for anyone to actually see it, is Morgan's Ridge. In 1893, a Croatian immigrant, a miner named Frank Kozel, was walking home one night after having worked an 11-hour shift in the coal mines. He decided to take a shortcut across the ridge through the woods. Which is always a good idea, T interjected sarcastically. Flora slapped his arm and shushed him. A shortcut through the woods, Gray continued with mock annoyance at the interruption, when something he described as being like a big white dog pounced on him. He swung at it with his metal lunchbox, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make contact with it. He tried to run away, but the creature kept on attacking him, jumping on him and knocking him down. Eventually, Frank made it to a cemetery, and the creature disappeared. It was then that he realized that through all the attacks, somehow, he hadn't been injured. Should have had horns, the raven-haired bass player said in a low, quiet voice. The others laughed. See, that's what I keep saying, Manson cried out. He laughed as he got to his feet to get another beer. I don't think what Frank Kozel saw was Sheepsquatch. It probably was just a big white dog or something. But other people, the ones who lost their livestock, described it as a badass creature with horns, like I said. I hear you, brother, Gray said. Either way, as most of us were raised here in Fairmont, it seemed only right that we should honor the name of our local legend, whatever form it takes. To Sheepsquatch, Manson said, raising the beer he had just opened. To Sheepsquatch, the others echoed with raised drinks. Well, as much fun as this has been, Flora and I need to head home across the ridge. Some of us have to work tomorrow. He stood and began to gather the chicken bones and paper bags from the meal he had shared with Flora. You didn't like my pizza? Dawn asked as she noticed what T had grouped to throw away. Oh, we love your special mushroom pizza, darling, Flora said. But since T has to work tomorrow, we didn't need anything quite that special. She smiled and wiggled her eyebrows, and all who were still seated around the fire pit chuckled. Eddie was puzzled at the inside joke, but just let it ride without commenting. T and Flora made their way around the fire, saying their goodbyes to their friends. Flora hugged Eddie and said, You be sure to look us up if you come back through these parts. Yeah, T echoed as he fist-bumped Eddie. They gripped right hands and hugged with their free arms. Like she said, look us up, bro. For sure, I'll do it. And likewise, if you ever come down to North Carolina. As the others settled back down to their places around the fire, Eddie said, I'm going to take a little stroll down by the river. Looked beautiful as I drove in. It's a perfect night for it, Dawn said. The moon is still almost full, and it's gorgeous when it shines on the water. Eddie smiled and walked away from the house down the trail where Gray had shown him to a good camping site earlier. As the voices around the fire faded, the sounds of the forest around him became crisper. The twigs cracking beneath his feet were so clear and loud, he felt as if he were wearing headphones. When an owl hooted and then flew off, Eddie ducked and threw his arms up, sure that the owl had flown right past his head. Were those its wings I felt on my face? Eddie rubbed his cheek and stared at the path the owl had taken through the trees. Small, multicolored particles drifted down like glitter mixed with snow, a magical fairy contrail left by the owl. Snarly Yow looked at him but cocked his head as if puzzled by Eddie's reaction. When the trail opened onto the bank of the river, Eddie gasped at the sight. Just as Dawn had said, the moonlight sparkling on the river was breathtaking. The scintillation on the water looked more like an animated movie than real life. Tiny spears of light burst from each point on the water with the sound of tinkling bells. Damn, I've never heard moonlight before, he thought. Eddie looked into the sky and noted that the craters on the moon had never been as visible, as pronounced, as he saw them then. For the first time in his life, he understood why people referred to the pattern as the man in the moon, for to his delighted amusement, the face turned towards Eddie and winked at him. Eddie stared back, amazed but unafraid. We meet again, my young friend. Eddie turned away from the river to identify the source of the voice behind him. It was Nick, the old man at the Devil's Tramping Ground, the first place Eddie had camped on his weird journey. But he was dressed very oddly. He wore a crimson jacket with elaborate gold trim and a tall black top hat. Black leather boots reached up to his knees. Welcome to the show. Nick turned and walked into the woods where he quickly vanished from view. Eddie heard the faint strains of music coming from the woods, music that he vaguely recognized from his childhood. It was organ music, or more specifically, the distinctive sounds of a calliope. He couldn't remember where it had been, but when he was only 3 or 4 years old, his parents had taken him to a carnival where he had ridden a carousel with the music he was presently hearing. Only then did he realize, as a chill ran through him, that the melody was the same as the song from the Bell Witch Cave, the song that Flora had sung in the park. Surprising even himself, Eddie stepped into the woods where Nick had disappeared without hesitation. Snarly Yow followed close behind. The wolf dog was unfazed by Nick's sudden appearance and simply followed wherever Eddie's interest led them. The music grew louder the further into the woods they went. Although the forest was dense, the leaves around him radiated a light that enabled him to make his way easily. Every vein on every leaf was visible. The patterns in the bark on the trees crawled with thin iridescent lines of neon blues and greens and a fiery orange. Soon Eddie came to a clearing which was obviously the source of the carnival music. An elaborate carousel turned slowly while horses, lions, and unicorns rose and fell on the poles that held them to the turning platform. That's it. That's the carousel from the carnival, Eddie cried out. Snarly Yow stood by Eddie's side, alert but with no obvious signs of alarm. He looked around as if trying to find the source of Eddie's excitement. Nick smiled at Eddie in a way that suggested predator more than friend. Indeed? He asked. How remarkable. He gestured toward Snarly Yow. And I see you brought our friend with you as well. Snarly huffed once, and then to Eddie's amazement, lay down and curled up with his head on his paws. Suddenly Eddie was aware that there were people riding the creatures on the carousel. A woman on the unicorn smiled and waved at him as she passed by. Mama. As the figure rotated away from Eddie, he recognized another woman rising and falling on the lion. Renee. She smiled at him and then, too, disappeared as the carousel turned. The creatures on the carousel changed as Eddie continued to stare. They no longer were the exotic animals and storybook creatures he remembered from his childhood, but had turned into monstrous, frightful things. A decaying dragon was followed by a skeletal horse. A hybrid creature with the head of a mangy wolf and the body and legs of a rotting boar came next. Goblin creatures replaced the women as riders, and they leered at Eddie and showed their yellow sharp teeth as they circled on the ride. Snarly Yow slept on as the carousel turned, and then Eddie saw another woman riding the skeletal horse. It was the woman he had spoken to at the Bell Witch farm. She wore the same long black dress, and her hair was tucked into the same tight bun he had seen her wearing then. She grinned maliciously at Eddie as she passed, and her face dissolved into that of a grinning skull. The speed of the turning carousel increased along with the tempo of the music, and Eddie saw another woman riding the decaying wolf boar. No, it can't be. The woman from the cave. She cackled like a witch, throwing her head back in a raucous laugh as she circled around into the darkness. The carousel turned even faster, and once again Eddie saw his mother. She rode the death horse now, and she seemed terrified. She held out one arm to Eddie as she gripped the pole tightly with the other. When she disappeared, Eddie saw Renee again, this time on the dragon creature. Nick no longer stood in the clearing, but was behind her, holding a knife to her throat. Renee's eyes were wide with fear. Eddie yelled and jumped onto the carousel, slicing his hand on the tooth of the wolfish creature as he gripped frantically for a handhold to keep from falling. He looked around at the other carousel creatures, but he seemed to be the only person on the ride. Out in the clearing, Eddie saw Nick restraining Renee while still holding the knife to her throat. The carousel spun faster, and the next revolution revealed the same scene, only it was the devilish figure Nick had transformed into back at the tramping ground that now held the knife. The carousel turned faster still, and in the quick glimpse Eddie had on the next turn, he saw himself holding the knife. Faster and faster the carousel turned, wobbling on its axis as if it might spin off at any second. Eddie tried to focus on the site where Renee stood captive, but she had vanished. Only Nick, as the devil, stood there, laughing. But on the next revolution of the carousel, there was another figure with him, fighting him. It was a furry, white beast with massive limbs and torso, a full head taller than the devil, and like the devil, it also had horns. The two struggled, falling onto the ground and rolling over and over in the leaves and dirt as they ripped and tore at each other. The wild turning increased, so much so that the carousel began to lift from the ground. Eddie crumpled to the floor, shutting his eyes to block the image of the clearing, the woods, and the river shrinking below him as he ascended into the night sky. And he screamed to drown out the mad, shrieking music of the calliope, which ultimately ushered him into unconsciousness. That concludes episode 12 of Wraiths of the Appalachian, Dark Friends. Which means there's only one more episode left in this third season of Dark Corners. Hope you've been enjoying the story and telling your friends about it. Perhaps you'll want to gather some of your friends together next week for a pre-Halloween party and listen to the conclusion together. Just a thought. I can imagine that you're wondering how all this will end for Eddie and Snarly Yow. I won't provide any spoilers. There are real wolf dogs, too, that you've heard me talk about before, whose fate is sadly just as uncertain as Snarly Yow's. But you could make life a little better by making even a small donation to help the volunteers feed and care for these magnificent creatures. Visit the Full Moon Farm Facebook page to see photos of these beautiful, loving dogs, and then go to the website at fullmoonfarm.org to learn how you can help this wonderful nonprofit charity, even if you can't make a home for a gorgeous wolf dog. As usual, I'll remind you, too, to check out the music of the man who created all of the great music for Dark Corners, Mombi Yulman, by going to his website at mombiyulman.bandcamp.com. Join us on the Dark Corners Facebook group to keep up with the latest announcements, backstories, and, of course, plenty of dark humor. See you next time for the conclusion of Wraiths of the Appalachian in the Dark Corners.